Prologue. The journey of one's life is largely determined by how well equipped one is to take it. Equipment can be physical or abstract, and range from supplies to temperament. If ill-equipped at the start of one's travels through life, the trip becomes more perilous, and our arrival at the destination we hoped for, less certain. My siblings and I were ill-equipped to travel, because our parents hadn't properly prepared us. We set out on our paths, did the best we could with what we had, and our journeys met with varying levels of success. It's safe to say, none of us ended up where we thought we were going. When I published the final episode of my coming out story, episode 8 of my overall series, my sister took offense at my choice to compress a particular timeline. I've decided to tell our whole story, and to do that, I need to take the long way round. If you don't want my opinion, episode 14, Ill-Equipped, by Carl Marking. After college, my father joined the Navy and married his high school sweetheart, my mother. Once married, they moved to Maryland, had their first child, my brother, and bought their first home in a predominantly middle-class neighborhood. About a year after moving in, my sister was born, and I came along 3 years later. I adored my sister when we were children. My happiest childhood memories within the family typically include her. The earliest memories I have of my sister aren't really mine. The first is from an old home movie. She's playing house with a sheet of vinyl imprinted with the image of a cottage that had cutouts for a door and a window or two. These were very common at the time. You'd drape it over a folding table, add children, some imagination, and it was a gift that kept on giving. The second is from another movie. From having heard the story so many times growing up, or a bit of both, our brother was given a toy bow and arrow as a present, and immediately shot our sister with it. That incident is the perfect metaphor for the entirety of their relationship. My clearest, earliest direct memory of my sister as a child is of our father having put us both in the bathroom one night with sheets of paper and crayons. Not our brother, just my sister and me. I was no older than 4, and probably 3. I can smell the musky dampness of the bathroom, see the tail from the roll of toilet paper swinging gently back and forth in the breeze from the heater vent, the 70s stripy wallpaper, and the ivory-colored Dixie cup dispenser with its bright metal band mounted to the wall above the sink. We sat side by side on the tiled floor, in our pajamas and our silence, as I drew the same amorphous image over and over. It's a soundless memory, encased like a snow globe, segregated from all other childhood memories. All I have preceding and following that memory are questions. Why were we in there? Where did our father take our brother? Where was our mother? The events leading up to and immediately following that memory are inaccessible to me and always have been. I think of that memory, alone in the bathroom with my sister, as a kind of safe harbor during an otherwise horrific period in my life. That memory, in just that amount, is what my brain decided I both needed and could handle. Nothing before it, and nothing after it. At that age, my sister embodied my sense of safety, and I believed that short memory acted as something of a beacon to my future self, as if my mind were saying, you may want to take a look at this memory someday, if and when you're ready. Until then, I'll just leave it over here, with the light on. Our home was not a safe place. Although I only have insight into my abuse, our father separated us from our brother that night for a reason. I asked my brother once, as adults, if he had any memory of ever having been molested by our father. He said he didn't. Years later, after he had a son of his own, as his son reached the age my brother would have been when my sister and I had been put in the bathroom that night, he once told me he was no longer sure. It's common to be unsure, and that lack of certainty doesn't really mean anything one way or another. But if something had happened, the mind does its best to give survivors access only to what they can handle and tries to shield us from the rest. A process that helps survivors survive, but sadly, also allows many abusers to get away with their abuse. When my siblings and I were very young, we used to meet our father in the driveway as he arrived home from work. We'd wait on the front steps, in the front yard, or venture to the corner of our street 2 doors down and listen for the distinctive whistle-chip purr of the engine of his pale yellow VW Beetle. Once parked in the driveway that ran alongside the house, we'd run to his car and wait as he recorded his mileage in the book he kept in the pocket of the driver's side door. He'd put it back, and as he pulled his hand free, he'd be holding treats for us, Boxes of Good and Plenty, Good and Fruity, packets of Sen, whatever he managed to scrounge up that day. We gladly accepted them and welcomed him home as we'd laugh and giggle with delight. We had a number of pets as children. The first I can recall was a Dalmatian. He once bit me, and like many Dalmatians, he was a handful and often got loose. We didn't have a fenced-in yard, and our parents quickly grew resentful of having to hunt for him when he'd run off on one of his adventures around the neighborhood. During one such hunt for him, they'd found he'd been hit by a car. The skin on the right side of his rib cage had been torn open. They took him to the vet, who dressed his wound and stitched the large flap of skin closed. After having been back home for a couple of days, he was lying in the dining room recovering. I went to pet him. He'd chewed through his stitches, and the skin from his wound had flopped open. I could see the layer of muscle underneath. It was one of the most disturbing things I'd ever seen. Within a couple of days, he was gone. "No, he didn't die," our mother said. "We decided to take him to a farm. He'll be happier there and able to run all he wants." I embraced this lie as truth. I vaguely remember a parakeet kept in a cage atop the refrigerator next to the small kitchen table. It often bit our parents, so they named it Hostile Feathers. I imagine the top of a refrigerator was not the best location for a bird cage, and its angry disposition was probably a reflection of its circumstances. One day it was found dead in its cage. No one could remember the last time it had been alive, which meant neither of our parents had fed it. They told that story to friends and neighbors for years and laughed every time. They starved that bird to death and found it amusing. Around the same time that we'd meet our father in the driveway for treats, when our house was still a home, it was often filled with music. Our father played string bass, the piano, the recorder, the melodica, and the accordion. Our mother played piano and trombone. We used to crowd around the upright piano in the basement, a gift from our mother's parents, and our father would play as we'd belt out songs and laugh. Then one day, it all but stopped. It was as if a different person had come home wearing our father as camouflage. There were no more treats at the car door. He no longer made us laugh, and coming together in celebration around music became less frequent, forced, and far less fun. Instead of meeting him in the driveway, my ritual became finding a place to hide around the time he'd usually get home. I'd listen for him to slam the front door shut behind him with such force the stemware on the shelves of the dining room wall would rattle, startled by the vibration that shook the frame of the house. Then the bickering between our parents would start, punishments would be doled out, the liquor would flow, and his mood would darken into night. I don't know what led to our father's abrupt personality change. The only life event he experienced that I'm aware of was the death of his father, but I can't say if the two events are related, any more than I know which came first, our father's drinking or his personality change. I was 3 when his father died, and barely remember him, beyond the whiff of his cigarettes. What I learned about him came from my siblings. They told the story of how during one of his visits to our house, he taught the neighborhood kids how to drink beer from a bottle. I learned he'd built the toy box that was in our shared bedroom, and that our mother's father, an artist, painted it with a circus theme that reminded me of a box of animal crackers. I learned our 2 grandfathers had worked together to repair an old wooden Pinocchio doll that belonged to our father as a child. The flip of its hair above its forehead and nose had been damaged. Our father's father patched the form. Our mother's father did his best to paint the repair to match the rest of the doll. That's all I know of him. Our father never spoke of him after he died, which gave the impression they weren't close. Our parents didn't have many mutual friends. Their first friends in the town I grew up in were their original neighbors, the Labors. They had purchased their respective homes within months of each other. The Labors had a daughter close in age to my brother and sister, and the 3 of them would often play together. She appears in many of our childhood home photos and movies. There's a family story that Mr. Labor was once struck by lightning and our mother, a nurse, helped take care of him as he recovered. The Labors moved to the other side of town when my sister was about 5, but Mr. Labor remained a constant in our lives. The only other set of mutual friends I remember our parents having were the Tobys. They had a daughter and son roughly the same age as my brother and sister. My brother and their son played together constantly, and my sister had a tremendous crush on him. He once gave her a plastic figurine of a grayish stallion which she loved dearly. They also moved away fairly quickly, when my sister was around 7. Their move took them further away, so visits were infrequent, but always an adventure and always fun. When the Tobys came to visit, I'd wait alone or with my sister at the corner of our street for their car to appear. Occasionally, our parents would load up the family station wagon and we'd make the trip to see them for the day. Distance, life, and time made such visits less frequent, and they eventually stopped altogether. Around the time the Tobys moved away, another dog came into our lives. He was a smallish black and white collie mix with a lush tail, curly-haired floppy ears, warm brown eyes, and looked as if he was wearing a black tuxedo with a white shirt. We named him Lucky. My sister and I took turns caring for him. He was a naturally empathetic dog and gave us the kind of pure, unquestioning love we both needed. One evening after dinner, our father, drunk, rose from the dining room table, entered the kitchen where Lucky was lying on the linoleum, knelt on the floor in front of him, and began referring to him as God. He then proceeded to confide in God his profound dissatisfaction and disappointment with his family, as we listened from the dining room. I often took Lucky out to do his business, and be sure he made his little star, so he didn't poop in the house. I'd also take him to my best friend Mikey's house 2 doors down. His family moved into the corner house where my siblings and I had once waited for our father to come home from work, hoping for treats. He had an older brother around my sister's age, and both an older and younger sister. His father made dental orthotics for the armed forces out of the lab in their basement. I was fascinated by the molds of strangers' mouths laid out on his workbench. Mikey's house had a large side lot, which was a magnet for the neighborhood kids. There were always games of kickball as long as the weather and daylight allowed for it. His parents were tolerant of being a destination for the children in the neighborhood, and so I was often on their property. My sister had a brief crush on his brother, which gave us both a mutual destination and reason to be together outside of our house. They also had a dog, Skippy, as well as a large fenced-in backyard, and Lucky and Skippy could run and play around all they wanted. One day I was taking Lucky for a walk. As I neared the house around the corner from Mikey's, one of the teenage girls who lived there came bounding out her front door. She ran up to us, jumped in the air, and landed on the sidewalk right in front of Lucky's muzzle. Startled, he snapped in reflex at the fabric of her denim bell-bottom jeans, breaking her skin at her ankle in the process. These neighbors were not the nicest people. Their son would light firecrackers and throw them at whoever was around. Once, while sitting with him on his front porch, he slipped one under my butt and lit the fuse. I wet myself when it exploded, which he found hysterical. They made our parents euthanize Lucky for being too aggressive. It was heartbreaking for my sister and me to lose the first thing in our lives that gave us regular, unconditional love. I don't believe she ever forgave me for his death. After her father's change in personality, dinner became a source of daily anxiety. He started saying things like, "Children should be seen and not heard," and "Honor thy father and thy mother." That was a favorite of his. Though not at all a religious man, he began quoting scripture as a shield to put the onus of proper behavior on us rather than on himself. We never knew what was going to set him off. There were always tears from some sort of torture conducted by our father, and none of us were spared. Seated at the head of the table, he would line up an arsenal of spices in front of his place setting. These would range from large plastic Tupperware salt and pepper shakers to more substantial glass spice bottles, the likes of McCormick's garlic salt or lemon pepper. He would ask one of us a question, and if he didn't like our answer, he'd choose an item from his arsenal, which he felt best suited our response, and throw it at the head of whoever had said it. Our mother didn't help reduce my stress around family dinners. If I were to ask her what was for dinner, she'd either tell me or say, "Poison." As time went on, the answer was most often, poison. The tension between our parents had become a physical presence at the table and in our house in general. Given my age at the time, I assumed their tension was somehow my fault. It was my fault Dad was in a bad mood. It was my fault Dad was yelling at Mom. It was my fault Mom was crying over some random thing, because I had done something. I was experiencing that false sense young children have that everything is because of something they did or didn't do. A sense that was, of course, reinforced by both my parents, as it suited their need to be in control and to deflect any responsibility away from themselves. Our parents were fairly active in the community. They served on the board at our YMCA for a time. Our father was in the Kiwanis Club, our mother in some version of our town's civics club, and they were both involved with scouting to varying degrees. Our father also had a small side hustle, selling Amway-like products, which took us to town fairs and events so he could set up shop. what went on at home was a far cry from their public image. Our childhood routine of school, chores, piano lessons, church, and scouting existed in parallel with our abuse, our parents' endless fighting, the keeping of family secrets, and our isolation. Secrets and isolation are how dysfunctional cultures of abuse survive. When I was 7, my brother began having me perform oral sex on his friends. It started one afternoon in the bedroom, while our sister and mother were in the kitchen making a lemon meringue pie. This abuse went on for over a year and forever altered my relationship with my brother. But this isn't that story. Family meals became an agony. Finishing quickly and asking to be excused would trigger our mother to chastise us for wanting to get away from her so quickly, after she'd invested so much time and effort putting the meal together. But if we stayed too long, we'd be pulled deeper into our father's web of cruelty. We were damned if we did and damned if we didn't. Our mother didn't resort to physical abuse, but nor did she stand up to our father. We each did our best to get through meals without incident and as quickly as possible. My brother eventually adopted the physical position of leaning forward over his plate, placing his free arm around the top of it to both protect it from being taken away and to allow him to shovel his food into his mouth as fast as possible. I tried to be invisible, but had also developed a series of nervous tics. I would either be targeted due to my silence or my tics. If my sister reached her limit and cried, her tears would often shoot straight out of her eyes rather than roll down her cheeks, a phenomenon our parents found amusing, so there was no comfort to be had for her either. Meals were a no-win scenario. Following the death of our father's father, his mother's physical and mental health began to decline quickly. Our father took over her estate, and the decision was made to add a second-floor addition to our house to move her in with us. Our mother first floated this news as glad tidings. "Won't it be fun to have Grandma living with us? And you'll all have your own rooms." I didn't know our father's mother as well as I knew our mother's mother, who adored me, paid me compliments, sang to me as she bounced me on her knee, and whenever she'd visit would read to me each night as she tucked me in. So, using the transitive property of grandmothers, I assumed I'd get the same treatment and thought, sure, that does sound pretty good. It was a stressful and exciting time when construction on the addition began. The plan was to make a doorway off the dining room to a staircase straight up to the second floor. There'd be 6 rooms, a new bedroom for our parents, 3 other bedrooms, a family room with a wood-burning fireplace, a full bath, and a room at the top of the stairs that hadn't been given a designation. My sister and I were excited at the news of getting our own bedrooms, but eventually learned our grandmother would be staying on the first floor, with us. We were not invited to live in the new space. We were to be left on the first floor with our grandmother, who would be moving into the 3rd bedroom. Our parents were not empathetic people, so emotional comfort was not the culture of our home. For as long as I can remember, my siblings and I would approach and avoid each other, like a tide coming in and going out. This was an extension of what was going on between our parents. Our family cycled through acting out, often against each other, and then taking comfort from one another when and where we could find it. Because my connection with my sister was so inconsistent, it was all the more impactful and special when it was working. She and I lived deep in our lives as children. To open our mouths was to become a target. It was important not to reveal too much about what we loved or valued, as it could be weaponized within the family, either through ridicule or by having said thing withheld or used against us as leverage. If you really want X, then you'd better do Y. Many parents use that kind of leverage, but ours took it to extremes, and as a result, we learned to be guarded in expressing what we truly wanted or needed. It often seemed the surest way not to get something in our family was to ask for or show interest in it. At some point, either leading up to or after her arrival, our father's mother had given my sister an old blue and white china tea set. My sister kept it in a cardboard box wrapped in the remnant of a plush purple bath rug. She'd occasionally invite me to tea in her bedroom, just her and me and her beloved teddy bear. Given the culture of our home, to be invited into my sister's room, and by extension her inner life, was almost sacred to me. I didn't have the language or perspective to understand it at the time, but being in her world made me feel special, valued, seen, and safe. My quintessential memory of my sister's room, the one that comes most often to my mind and burns brightest, is one of its earliest incarnations after our parents had moved upstairs and she'd taken over their old room. She had a corner desk with adjoining dressers and shelving, A freestanding bookshelf filled with books, including her Nancy Drew mysteries, under the window next to her double closet. The floor was simple hardwood with white scatter rugs. On her bed was a bright red comforter that our mother had purchased from Sears. The print of the fabric was modeled after a quilt. There were different squares, each featuring a different image. An old man representing a grandfather, an old woman with her gray hair in a bun representing a grandmother, a small curled-up dog, and other things. Randomized throughout was a square reading, "Grandma loves you." Our father's mother arrived one day. She still wore her horn-rimmed glasses, though she was almost completely blind and used a folding cane to navigate her way. Her cognition was also clearly in decline. The living situation made no sense given my sister and I were so young, and our grandmother clearly needed a level of adult supervision and assistance neither of us could supply. If our father had finished the room at the top of the stairs, we could have all moved up together as a family. We could have all enjoyed the comforts of the new space, including its central air conditioning. Instead, our parents had created a pecking order, and my sister, our grandmother, and I were at the bottom. They had long ago made their preference for our brother quite clear, but to leave us behind, downstairs, with our declining grandmother, it didn't add up. My sister seemed glad to have both her own room and the physical distance from our parents and brother, but I felt abandoned. When she first arrived, we enjoyed a period of improved behavior on the part of our father, but once his mother had settled into a routine, his behavior reverted. He was home less often and drinking more. My sister and I bickered and shouted at each other, and sometimes our exchanges were unkind and occasionally physical. Children are children and behave accordingly, but they also reflect the attitudes and behaviors they learn from their caregivers. There were the times, if I moved too slowly for her liking, that she'd shove me down the last few steps to our basement. There were the times she and my brother would hide in the bedroom at night, jump out at me, and scare me to tears. There was the time she and my brother tripped me while I was coming out of the bathroom, causing me to careen forward and split my forehead open on the outside corner of the opposite wall. And there were their claims for years that I wouldn't live to see my 21st birthday. It was such an odd and specific thing to tell me as a child. I never figured out where that came from. Our home was one of endless dysfunction, filled with our parents' constant bickering, our father's personality change, the restructuring of our home following the new addition, our grandmother's arrival, and my sexual abuse at the direction of my brother that no one seemed to know anything about. It was surprising we functioned as well as we did, and that things weren't worse than they were. One morning at breakfast, my sister and I were having cereal. The box indicated there was a packet of strawberry milk mix inside. She didn't usually care for cereal box prizes, but we both enjoyed strawberry milk. We were sitting at the square kitchen table. I had my back to the fridge, and she was directly across from me. She grabbed the cereal box, poured enough out to reveal the packet, pulled it from the box, and waved it at me in victory, as one would naturally do. I did what any sore loser would do at that age, scooched down in my chair and tried to kick her under the table. Given the size of the table, my age, height, mass, muscle strength, and our distance from one another, I would have been hard-pressed to make physical contact with her, but it didn't stop me from trying. She knew what I was going to do, and in anticipation, quickly jerked her chair back. Unfortunately, her chair was at the top of the open staircase leading down to the basement. I imagine the back feet of her chair caught the lip of the metal trim that anchored the linoleum to the floor at the top step. She and the chair tilted sharply backward. Down the stairs she went, ass over shoulders, breaking her arm in the process. I don't remember her giving me much grief about the incident. She even let me sign her cast. But our parents, on the other hand, placed the blame for her broken arm completely on me. They said it was my fault so often, I believed them. I was responsible for breaking her arm, and I felt terrible about it. I loved my sister. As an adult, looking back, the question I ask is this: what reasonable parent puts a table at the top of a flight of stairs with no barrier between said table, the stairs, and their children? But then, reasonableness was not the status quo in our family. Our parents were incapable of holding a mirror up to themselves to examine their role in anything that transpired in their house. As our grandmother's health declined, the tension between our parents increased, and they were openly fighting about the level of care she required. Given our mother's degree in nursing, it seemed to me our father would have preferred she played nursemaid to his mother indefinitely, but our mother was not interested in being nurse to his. I came home from school one day and went into my grandmother's room. She was fully dressed and reclining on her bed. I crawled up to give her a hug, and she began screaming, "Pig! Someone get this pig out of my bed!" I was terrified of her after that outburst. When she began mistaking the magazine rack to the right of the bathroom door at the end of the living room sofa for the toilet, that seemed the final straw for our mother, and talks to put her in a home began. By the end of her time with us, she would sit, either in a chair at the dining room table or on the edge of her bed, and stare silently into the sightless void that was her world. She looked like our grandmother, but she no longer was. Our parents moved her into a nursing home. I remember visiting her only once as a family. The ward where she stayed was nothing more than a long row of hospital beds with curtains providing the illusion of privacy. The fluorescent lighting was overly bright, and the place smelled of urine. That summer, I was sitting on the curb in front of our house one afternoon when Kevin, the older brother of my friend Jim, rode up on his bike. He said he'd heard I was giving blowjobs to other boys, and said he and his friends wanted me to do it to them. I said no. He offered me money. I again said no, but more firmly. He threatened me physically. Finally, I shouted, "No!" and ran into the house. Word of my refusal got back to my brother. He stopped our parents in the living room as they were about to leave for an evening out, and told them I'd been sexually exploring with my friend Jim. I assume he told them that either in retaliation for my refusal to participate in his abuse any longer, or as a preemptive strike to control the narrative, fearing I'd tell our parents what he'd done, what he'd been doing, for more than a year. Our mother immediately made the news about herself. "How could you do this to me?" she screamed through her tears. I dove under the coffee table in fear, tears running down my cheeks, anticipating the inevitable beating from our father. He didn't say a thing, not one word. His silence was completely out of character. I was so scared, confused, and ashamed by what my brother had done to me that I had no intention of ever saying anything to our parents. I wanted to put it all behind me and forget it had ever happened. And I knew, even at the age of 8, if I tried to tell our parents what had happened, they wouldn't have believed me. I would most likely have been punished rather than heard, supported, and protected. Neither of our parents had any interest in exploring or discussing my brother's revelation and left for their evening out as planned. My father's beating never came. In fact, they never mentioned the matter to me again. But after that night, my father had almost nothing to do with me unless circumstances required it. That winter, my sister and I were ice skating at the frozen drainage pond next to the new elementary school a few blocks from our house. Kevin approached me on the ice and once again began harassing me to blow him and his friends. When I again refused, he got rough with me. My sister saw I was in trouble and intervened. She intimidated a kid years older than she, with such grit he left in fear of her and never approached me again. She couldn't have known it at the time, but her intervention helped me solidify the healthier path I was finally able to choose for myself that prior summer. In elementary school, the music teacher would seat the class in a circle and pass around various instruments. You had the opportunity to see if it was something you were interested in pursuing. My brother, like our mother, had landed on the trombone. My sister, the French horn. I remember bringing a trumpet home one night and sitting on the living room sofa trying over and over to make a sound. When I finally did, I burst into happy tears. Being able to play a brass instrument, like my brother and sister, gave me a surprising sense of belonging. There was a brief period when our father seemed interested in either reestablishing his place in the family or rebranding his image. He grew a mustache, he'd leave for work each day with a gym bag, he tried to get us all into bicycling. I recall one embarrassing ride around the neighborhood as a family, but thankfully that didn't stick. For a time he got it into his head we should try our hand at being a family band, and we froze our asses off on a downtown street corner one Christmas, playing carols as a quintet. Thankfully that too quickly fell by the wayside. Next we all had to take up roller skating, something my sister and I actually enjoyed. Skating got us out of the house, it was fun, and the live organ music at our local rink always made me happy. One of my favorite memories of time spent with my sister was practicing shoot the duck in our skates in the finished part of the basement. Our father never seemed able to stick with any one thing for very long, and he soon moved on to other things. Over time, perhaps tired of his attempted rebrand, he eventually reverted back to form. He called my sister and me into the dining room one Saturday morning. "I've got a dollar amount in mind for each of you if you clean the basement," he said. We jumped at the chance to earn extra money, as we'd learned that money meant a certain amount of freedom and self-determination. We spent the mornings sorting his cases of never-sold cleaning products, sweeping, mopping, dusting, and killing the creepy spiders that seemed to be everywhere in the damp basement. Once finished, we found him at the dining room table. "I'll give you twice what I was going to if you also straighten up the attic," he said. We spent the rest of the day sweeping up the attic, clearing out the dead flies, cleaning the windows at either end, and sorting through the clutter. We presented ourselves once again and listed all that we'd accomplished so we could collect our hard-earned money. He reached into his pants pocket, put out his hand, and revealed an empty palm. "I was going to pay you nothing for the basement, and twice that is still nothing." My sister, no one's fool, was so angry she couldn't speak. I was taken completely by surprise and devastated. We left him at the table as he laughed loudly by himself. During the run-up to Christmas, he asked my sister and me to pick out the gift he should give our mother. We spent weeks poring through catalogs for area stores, dog-earing pages, writing down things we thought our mother would like, that he'd also be willing to spend money on. We approached him to present our choices. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "I already got her something." We were crushed. I don't know what lesson he thought he was teaching us, but the one I learned was that our father could not be trusted. When I was around 9, our father went to South Korea for work. Our brother was old enough that he spent as much time as possible out of the house at a friend of his who lived a couple of blocks away. This was my first glimpse as to how peaceful things could be when my brother and father were absent from our lives. He was probably only gone for a couple of weeks, but it felt like a month to me at the time. While our father was away, our mother was more relaxed than I'd ever seen her, and the house wasn't in a constant state of action and reaction. The three of us, my mother, my sister, and I, were able to uncoil a bit and came to enjoy each other's company. Our father called one day and told our mother he was bringing gifts for all of us. His idea of bringing us gifts from a work trip once ended with my sister getting a small bar of hotel soap. "What's this?" she asked when he handed it to her. "It has your name on it," he said. Sure enough, the hotel bar of soap happened to be branded with her name. She was distinctly unimpressed. When he arrived home, he had brought a few things with him on the plane: small South Korean flags, banknotes and coins, some clothing, and a carved white jade pendant necklace for our mother. He explained the rest of the gifts were coming later, but given the Christmas gift ruse, the time he tricked my sister and me into cleaning the basement and the attic with an empty promise of money, and his past history of thoughtless gifts, I was skeptical. Later that day, before he unpacked, hoping to discover some extra present, I snuck into our parents' room, rummaged through his luggage, and found 2 more surprises: a half-used tube of Doc Johnson's Joy Jelly personal lubricant, and an almost empty box of condoms. I realized my father was having sex outside his marriage. I chose not to tell my mother. I didn't want to hurt her any more than I wanted to be punished or beaten for either snooping or revealing such a dark secret. I couldn't trust telling either of my siblings. I felt my brother would weaponize the information, and believed my sister would feel compelled to tell our mother, regardless of the consequences. I chose to carry our father's secret in silence. In time, to my surprise, the other presents he had promised eventually arrived. But the best gift he gave us, completely by accident, was an understanding of what life could be like when he wasn't around. The gift of knowing how it felt not to be afraid every day. The gift of being able to connect with each other and alleviate the loneliness his behavior brought into our lives. People who grow up in abusive homes, or homes that hide big secrets from friends and neighbors, know the loneliness and isolation that comes with keeping such things hidden. Between our grandmother's condition, our father's drinking, and his erratic, often violent demeanor, we didn't have people over often when we were young. Once the Labors and Tobys moved away, I don't recall my sister having another neighborhood friend. Not really. My last neighborhood friend was Mikey. His house with its large side yard had always been full of kids and games of kickball. It was centrally located within the neighborhood, and had a street lamp where the kids would hang out on warm evenings, squeezing every second of summer out of every day. When it came to life, and the bats began to circle, that was the universal cue to head home. Mikey's family moved away, and our friendship was severed by default. Our house felt lonelier than ever. Around the time I was in 5th grade and my sister in 8th, I knocked on her door, slowly opened it, and saw a brief flash of her clothing as she rolled off her bed onto the floor between her bed and wall. It seemed we shared a common strategy for avoiding our father and brother. We hid. I quietly called her name. "Oh, I thought you were him," she said, and came out from hiding. Him was interchangeable for our father and brother. I had used her bedroom as a hiding place from him for years. I would hide either under her bed among the dust bunnies, or in her closet, closing the door behind me, occasionally falling asleep among her shoes and toys. Our bedroom closets shared a common interior wall. When things had been particularly bad for me, I took a drywall handsaw and cut a hole from my closet into hers, in case I needed a quick escape. By this point in our lives, she'd all but completely disappeared into her bedroom. She had her own record player and a radio she used to listen to radio broadcasts of TV shows like Fantasy Island and The Love Boat. She was an avid reader for pleasure. She'd given up piano lessons but could practice her French horn in her room. Other than food, water, and a bathroom, she had everything she needed, and only ventured out when her father and brother weren't around, or when she had no choice. She was coping as best she could with the hand she'd been dealt, and chose self-imposed exile. It wasn't her responsibility to take care of me, but it was the role she had assumed for many years, and she did it better than anyone else. I was too young to realize she had her own life to lead, and her own damage to work through, and her absence left me feeling rejected and abandoned. I envied her ability to separate from the rest of us, and wished I could have done the same. Between my abuse, our father's alcoholism and violent nature, and my learning of his affair, I was carrying too many secrets alone. There was also a slow realization within me that there was something different about me, something I couldn't quite understand or grasp. One day, in 5th grade, a classmate told me to stop being such a fag. I had a sense of the word, but I didn't really understand what it meant. When I got home from school, I pulled out our well-worn dictionary with the white pleather cover. It was unabridged, which made it perfect for pressing flowers. The one I'd put in there last summer was now perfectly preserved. I lay down on my belly on the living room floor and flipped to the F's. The definition of faggot referred me to homosexual, which referred me to homosexuality, which explained for me just what that something different about me might be. "Huh," I said and closed the dictionary. It had been many years since Mr. Labor had moved out of our neighborhood. He had divorced, remarried, and they had a beautiful home across town. They had an in-ground pool with a water slide and diving board, a cabana house, an actual caboose from an old railroad train that he spent years restoring, and the main house was filled with fascinating things from all the places they'd traveled. My sister's adoration and respect for Mr. Labor had grown over the years. It was clear to me that he was the father figure she never had. He was accomplished, stern, kind, thoughtful, interesting, generous, and always looked out for her. They had a special bond. Every child needs someone in their life who sees them, and he was that someone for her. Each summer, Mr. Labor hosted a pool party. My sister and I looked forward to any opportunity to share space with them, but those pool parties were a highlight of our summers, both because our parents got along for the day, and because Mr. Labor threw one hell of a party. We had as much fun during that one party as we did over an entire summer. One year I was in the pool beneath the diving board as my sister stood above me, deciding if she wanted to dive in. I reached up, grabbed her ankle, and tried to pull her off the board and into the pool. I knew she'd be angry with me, but I figured we'd quickly laugh it off. I hadn't accounted for the fact she'd instinctively try and avoid the fall. It was an echo of what happened when she and my brother had tripped me while I was coming out of the bathroom many years earlier. In trying to rebalance herself, as I had done during her and my brother's bathroom prank, her trajectory changed, and she hit her chin on the diving board as she fell into the water. She was bleeding. Mr. Labor quickly plucked her from the pool, held her to his chest, and rushed her inside the main house, her blood blaring bright red in the sun against his crisp white shirt. It seemed as if the entire party had come to a stop, as everyone turned to scowl at me, muttering harsh, judgmental words. It was the one time in our lives I can remember clearly and directly causing my sister physical harm. I felt sick about it. She was okay and we both moved on, but to this day, I get a twinge of guilt and regret when I think about that scene. We began drifting apart around this time, as much from our 3-year age gap as anything else. We were developmentally out of sync and had very different coping mechanisms for the trauma we'd endured at home. As soon as she could, she started working. Her first job that I recall was at Mr. Labor's furniture store, dusting. She worked as often as she could, which took her further away from me and increased my sense of isolation. Our connection was fading, and it was a palpable loss for me, so I decided to emulate her behavior to compensate. I began reading some of the books she loved, starting with Mary Stuart's The Crystal Cave, an account of the early life of Merlin from the legend of King Arthur. I also began finding as many ways to be out of the house as possible, and when I had to be home, I took solace in my room. Like her, I became a voracious reader. The unfinished room at the top of the stairs to the second floor finally had a purpose when a Radio Shack TRS-80 Model 1 Level 2 computer arrived with its cutting-edge 16K cassette tape-driven memory system. The room was henceforth known as the computer room. Other than a couple of chairs and the old kitchen table, the room remained curiously unfinished. I never knew what our father did for a living, not really. I knew he had been in the Navy. His uniform hung in a garment bag in the basement laundry area. I was told he once taught physics at some naval training center and had something to do with nuclear subs. I was told that once he left the Navy, he worked on war game scenarios and had top-secret clearance. I can't say how much of that is accurate. I only knew what I'd been told. I remember him bringing work home that consisted of binders of data, and that he'd occasionally have computer programming punch cards in his briefcase. His purchase of a home computer made sense to me, and my sister and I seemed the most dedicated to figuring out how it worked. I was very good at chess, which was the computer game I spent most of the time playing. Very slow games of chess. Then a program came into the house that enthralled my sister, called Eliza. Eliza was marketed as an artificial intelligence simulator. The packaging had a black silhouette of a young girl with her hair and collar styled as if she were from the Victorian era. Written on her head was, "How do you do? My name is Eliza. What is your problem?" We all had problems by this age, but the app gave my sister an opportunity to confide in something that would never violate her trust. Eliza worked under the premise of being a psychoanalysis tool. It had a framework of canned questions and could parrot back things the user had previously input. A sample conversation could go like this. The words, "How do you do? Please state your problem," would appear on the screen. One could type, "I am angry with my mother." "What would being angry with your mother mean to you?" Eliza would reply. My sister earnestly poured her heart out to this chatterbot. It would respond with something like, "What makes you so sure?" or "Let's change the subject," or "Please go on." After a time, it would respond with something like, "Earlier you said you were angry." It only offered the facade of conversation which, to someone who already felt ignored and unseen, was unintentionally cruel. My sister would inevitably leave the interaction in tears, and when she realized it couldn't help her, she gave up and never went back. She needed answers, not more questions, or the illusion of someone being interested in her. We got enough of that at home. The summer before I started 7th grade, our parents got a call from the nursing home that our grandmother had died. Our father decided to have an open casket. It was the first funeral I can remember. As I stood beside her coffin, I expected her eyes to fly open at any moment, and for her to scream, "Pig!" A year later, I was in 8th grade. My sister was a junior in high school, and our brother a freshman in college. It was a pivotal year for our family. Our brother had moved out of the house and into the campus dorms. Our father was also hardly ever home, and when he was usually pissed drunk and incapacitated. Alternatively, he'd arrive home late, often drunk or well on his way, and sit at the dining room table where he'd use the small suction cup that came with his new contact lenses, trying to pluck them from his eyes. Once accomplished, he'd work his way upstairs, put on his dark brown nightshirt, continue drinking until he passed out in the family room in front of the TV, and eventually make his way to bed. Late that winter, a week before my sister's 17th birthday, I had been studying at the public library. Night had fallen, it was below freezing, and the librarians had politely, but firmly, kicked me out of the building to close for the night. I waited for my mother by the low stone wall alongside the front sidewalk. 5 minutes became 20 before I saw the headlights of her car approaching. As soon as it came to a stop, I opened the car door and my mouth. "It's about time. I'm freezing." She had clearly been crying. I assumed she and my father had had another fight. "My mother called," she said. "Daddy died." She burst into fresh tears. I joined her. We cried without saying a word all the way home. I loved my grandfather, but in that moment I was crying because at that age, if my mother cried, I cried. It was a hardwired emotional response. Unlike our father's mother, he had kept his faculties and physicality until the very end. I was told he died from a heart attack while doing something he loved, shoveling snow. Our summer vacations were almost always spent in his home, and my memories are full of the things my sister and I would do while there. Block parties, seeing our cousins, exploring the museum where he had worked, going to the zoo, where he had painted many murals. It had an aviary that my sister could not set foot in without some bird pooping on her, which immediately led to tears when she was a child. It also had injection mold vending machines near each of the various animal habitats. For just a few quarters, you could watch it create a figurine of a nearby animal through the glass case of the machine. I remember with perfect clarity how the figurines smelled and felt as they cooled in my hands. We flew out to be with our grandmother, who was devastated but stoic. She held her Manhattan in one hand and a lit cigarette in the other. The viewing was initially just family. As we waited for the room to open to the public, I kept looking around but couldn't find the casket. Just a bunch of flowers at the front of the room. I assumed they'd bring his coffin in at any minute. "Where's the casket?" I asked my sister. "There isn't one. He was cremated." He was 69 by the time I was born, and had already played grandfather to 6 other children. When we visited, he kept to his routine, but he would occasionally have to drive one or all of us somewhere. He was quiet, still painting, and didn't put up with any nonsense. Trust didn't come easily for me, especially with men. He was consistent and safe. I trusted him. That trust, his talent, and his constancy were enough to make me respect and love him. I struggled with his death. I think it was because I never got to see his body. An urn of ashes wasn't my grandfather. I'd see imagined glimpses of him in crowds for years. For my 14th birthday, about a month after his death, my grandmother gave me 2 surprising things: a year's subscription to Psychology Today, which made my parents oddly uncomfortable, and a teddy bear with golden brown fur. It was about 14 inches tall, had a brown satin ribbon tied around its neck, and dark brown plastic eyes. I'd never had a teddy bear. It wasn't the most age-appropriate gift, but I slept with it for months and thought of my grandmother's love and kindness each night as I eventually fell asleep. Several months later, I put it back in its bed of white tissue paper, in its white lidded box, and put it on the shelf of my bedroom closet. I had a disturbing exchange with our father one night, and the next morning, while watching TV with my sister in the basement, our mother called me upstairs and asked if I was a faggot. "No," I said. "Because if you are, we need to get you fixed," she replied. And just like that evening 6 years earlier, when my brother told my parents I'd been fooling around sexually with my friend Jim as they were on their way out for the evening, the matter was dropped and never discussed again. That year at school, I became overly sensitive to my classmates calling me a fag. When we were younger, fag was a ubiquitous slur we hurled at any boy if they were acting strangely in some way. But by 8th grade, given what had happened between my father and me, and my growing realization that I actually may be a fag, it bothered me deeply. I sought help from the school guidance counselor, but the session didn't go well, and I realized she'd be no help. My sister went to Germany with her high school German language class over spring break. She and my brother had a tremendous physical and verbal fight about it. Our parents had not paid for him to go to Germany with his class years earlier, and so he told her that she wasn't allowed to go. The problem with his logic was that she'd been saving money for that trip for years and was going to pay for it herself. Their argument became physical and ended with him throwing a fork at her. She raised her arm to shield her face and torso. The fork stuck in her forearm. The trip came, she went, and had a beautiful time. She brought back so many mementos for herself and so many things for me. All sorts of foreign candy and chocolates, sew-on patches from every place she'd visited, and a green plastic pen and holder shaped like a ski. Her attitude toward me had noticeably changed in my favor. As for our brother, their relationship was never the same. Something else happened around this time, between my sister and father. I was in my room and heard them arguing. I came out to see what was happening, and her father had her shoved against a wall in her bedroom, his hands on her chest. She shoved him backward with all her might, and he flew from her room in a rage. Having seen that look on his face many times before beating, I fearfully ducked back into mine. I couldn't remember him ever having been physical with her before. She had found her voice by this age and could stand her ground with him verbally when necessary. I always thought she was his favorite. Smart, talented. He promised her money if she got straight A's, which she did. He used to enlist her help from time to time for his job, and they'd spend hours at the dining room table working through whatever it was he brought home with him in his briefcase. But after their encounter in her bedroom, she engaged with him only when she had no other choice but to do so.